We'll get on
Okay.
to the historical context of your career in a moment, but in our correspondence, you told me that you're more interested in talking about the future. To what extent did that attitude help you refine your political career?
Well, I suppose that, like everybody else, I've lived in the moment. I do live in the moment as human. I take what memory and instruction I can from the past, but that's generally for the purpose of thinking about the future. So that's, I don't think I've ever been asked this question before. Hence my hesitation or attempt to gather my thoughts. Yeah, I suppose that's how it all fits together. You live now, meet today's challenges, opportunities, fun, sadness, encounters of various kinds. You are shaped in part by your own past, but you try to take memory, instruction, indications from the past, some of it very long term, long before I was born, from my parents, grandparents, the community I grew up in. And then, possibly because of my political values, but also because I've got children and grandchildren, about the future too. And that's how it fits together. As I said, some of that is just my personal makeup. Some of it is because of the political convictions that I have.
Yeah. So we're currently living through quite a fractious period for politics, with public trust in Parliament arguably at an all-time low. In your opinion, how damaging is the current situation with Partygate in the disillusionment of young voters?
I think it's very, very, very important. Partly, of course, because by its very nature, illusion is part of the makeup of being young. And that can be very good and very positive because it gives you hopes and ideals for the future, and hopes and ideals which you hope can be quickly recognized. Impatience is also part of being young and growing up, and that's entirely healthy. It's a real source of energy, in my view, and perception. So that's great. But then when you're confronted as a thinking youngster by the apparent corruption of institutions, especially the representative democratic institutions, you begin to lose faith in the institutions themselves and think that the instrument that you've been taught makes progress possible is actually itself an impediment to that progress. Now, if you can get past that and think that what's wrong with this institution, our form of government, our parliament, our democracy can be improved and must be improved, that's okay, because you will work to improve them, to cleanse them, to sharpen them, to modernize them, to make them more representative. And that's terrific. If, however, and this is happening to too many people, you decide that there's really no point and you become disrespectful of or distrusting about those institutions, and you drop out of your obligations as a citizen to be part of the community, to use your vote, to organize for improvement, whether it's saving a local library or swimming pool or cleaning up the park or trying to change the world, raise consciousness about climate change, unemployment, poverty, inequality, injustice. If you uh, use your energies in that way, then that's healthy in a way. But if this shadow of disenchantment, disillusionment, disbelief hangs over it, it tends to make you drop out of citizenship. That is what makes it dangerous. The most lethal phrase of all, partly because it's just not true, but also because it is very, very disabling, is they're all the same. They're all the same. It's very easy to get there. I can understand how people get there, but I appeal to youngsters to dig a little deeper and discover they are not all the same, not just because they're in different parties with a different set of beliefs, but because most of them are engaged in the representative process because they want to make things better. And really the challenge is to representatives to stand up for what they believe in and the people who elected them. When they do that, then hope and belief returns. When they don't do that, then hope and belief are dissipated. That is really dangerous for democracy. So the withdrawal of youth from engagement in politics at any time is wrong, and it inflicts harm upon themselves and their future. But at the moment, it seems to be more epidemic than it's been at most times during my life. And it has got to be very vigorously resisted, because we can't leave the future to chance and to scoundrels and to liars. And the only way to stop that is to get organized and be engaged.
Yeah. So another sort of
But the
pretty bleak.
answer,
Yeah, that's
that
great.
question went very deep.
Yeah.
I welcome it, but I also commend it very strongly.
Another pretty bleak period for Britain, the 1970s, with a 3-day week, mass unemployment and the miners' strike. What was it about that time that made you seek your career in politics?
I don't, well, I know I've never had a career in politics because I've never thought of it in those terms. I mean, it happens that I've been a member of the Labour Party since I was 14. I never saw it as a career or a job, but as the cookie crumbled, and it is often a matter of luck rather than deliberate planning of any kind, I was elected to a very strong Labour seat in South Wales when I was 28 in 1970. So in the sense that a career is what you did for a living through much of your lifetime, yep, I had a career, but I never thought of it as a job. To me, it was always a vocation, a purpose, a way of trying to work in an organized and rational fashion to secure improvement, to make things better. And that's a bit pious, but it isn't. That is what motivated me when I was a kid. And then when I was an adolescent and a grown up with a family of my own, that's still how it is in a way. Although I'm 80 years of age now, I still think of democratic politics as a way of advancing, improving the condition of humanity. And obviously, that includes the communities that are disadvantaged and need a voice, and causes that need to be projected and organized. so that they serve the needs of justice and equity, fairness, and opportunity. So I'm still involved in that, even though I retired about 15 years ago.
Yeah. Mentioned when you were younger there, growing up in Wales, how did you and your family view the Welsh relationship with the rest of Great Britain in terms of politics, and how did that lay some foundations for your interest?
As I think most people of my generation would testify, in the period before the turn of this century, actually, people in Wales and Scotland and England didn't think of their politics in terms of their nationality. Plainly, we were proud in cultural terms, in sporting terms, in terms even of humor, of being distinctively Welsh. And people thought in the same terms of being distinctively from Merseyside Scousers or Geordies or Yorkshire people or Cockneys. But it was always a reflection on where we stood and our customs and sources of pride in achievement, rather than relative to any other parts of the country. It's only in the last 20 odd years that most people, outside those who are moved by nationalistic sentiments, have thought of themselves not only in terms of where they are and they are from and their accent and their immediate community, but also relative to other geographical communities. I mean, our class consciousness was alive and well and justified, but our Welsh consciousness was not political. Now, it's difficult for people who are young today, and by young, I mean, let's say under 45, to realize that just a short time ago, that feeling of division, even enmity, didn't really exist on the mainland of the United Kingdom. But it's the truth. And if you were to ask your parents and grandparents' generation, and they were honest, I guess they'd say much the same. I mean, you can encounter people who will have said in 1985, well, I don't like Welsh people very much, or I can't stand people from Surrey. You could find those, but it was skin deep. It wasn't a matter of strong political reaction. One of the factors, or there are two factors, I think, that have contributed to this change in geographical perception and feelings. The one is the massive change in the form of our economy in the last 40 years. The virtual destruction, particularly under the Margaret Thatcher government, of so much of large-scale manufacturing industry. I can go into the reasons for that, but it's a fact of life. And what you lose if you lose an industry that's been established for 100, 120, 150 years is not just the jobs, but the realities of relationships and community and identity that go with it. And that's been a massive change, and it's made people more introverted for understandable reasons about where they are where they've come from, where they think they're going. The second reason is more formal, if you like. The development of the kind of devolution that we've got in the United Kingdom since the late 1970s, and then developing further right through to the creation of devolved institutions in Scotland and Wales in the late 1990s, means that the divisions that were developing because of economic and industrial change were codified as political divisions in institutions. So it made people more conscious of primarily being Scottish or Welsh, and by reflection, English too. So that's where we're at now. And what we've got to do is to concentrate on the practical and the positive, and make the United Kingdom feel much more like the United Kingdom again, not for nationalistic reasons, but for reasons of our own nourishment and the seizure of our own opportunities. If we're divided, we lose a lot of that nourishment, that enrichment, and we lose a hell of a lot of opportunities.
So in 1983, you replaced Michael Foot as the leader of the Labour Party and consequently the leader of the opposition. How difficult was it to go up against such a political powerhouse in Thatcher?
Oh, that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was trying to get the Labour Party into shape, because at the time, through no fault of Michael's, it was a complete shambles in policy terms, organization, constitutionally, financially, a total bloody mess. So that was my main task. It's unfortunate because, of course, my real job was going after Thatcher and the Conservatives, who were inflicting really serious damage on the country and on people who were extremely insecure because of her policies. But I had to give most of my time, unfortunately, to concentrating on trying to make the Labour Party a convincing political organization and a serious alternative to the Conservative government. So that was unavoidable. It just was part of the territory, and I knew that when I took over, which is one of the reasons why any sensible person wouldn't have done it.
So just a year into your leadership tenure, Britain and Argentina collided for ownership of the Falkland Islands.
No, that was 82. That was before I became leader. Though I did support the military deployment against the Argentine fascists, the junta that was running the country at the time and responsible for the invasion of the Falklands, while at the same time criticizing Margaret Thatcher and her government for allowing that absolute outrage to take place with awful casualties and terrible danger to the people of the Falklands, because the Falkland War was her fault and her government's fault, which is why, to his credit, Lord Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, resigned 2 days after the invasion. But that would all happen before I became leader.
What do you think you would have done differently if you had been in power in order to restore peace and preserve life?
Oh, well, because of the dreadful errors of the, let me go back a little bit. In 1978, the Argentine junta had threatened to do exactly the same thing. And what the Labour government and the Jim Callaghan did was to redirect a naval exercise taking place off Gibraltar into the South Atlantic or towards the South Atlantic. As soon as the Argentines got word that a substantial naval force, 2 cruisers, an aircraft carrier, and several destroyers and submarines were on their way to the South Atlantic as part of the quote exercise, they just pulled back, and not a life was lost, not a bullet was fired, and the crisis was completely averted without getting too much attention, actually. But that showed what could be done with an intelligent view of the nature of the Argentine government. And of course, we kept the naval surveillance ship in the South Atlantic throughout the whole period, whereas the Thatcher government withdrew them from the South Atlantic Patrol, sending the signal to the Argentines that she at least wasn't serious about safeguarding the Falkland Islands. Against that historic background, if I'd been presented with exactly the situation of 82, I would have said, yes, we have got to respond to brutal force with convincing force. I probably would have not deployed the naval force and the military force quite as early for 2 reasons. First of all, as the veterans of the Falklands would tell you, as they told me many, many times, both the Navy and military personnel, especially in the Welsh Guards and the Commandos, that they weren't ready. Some of the ships were still being painted when they left Portsmouth Harbour. And secondly, President Reagan had eventually stirred himself and his government to put pressure on the Argentines. And it may have been the case that because of the degree of dependence of the Argentine on the USA, they could have got them diplomatically to pull their forces out. Even if they hadn't, then of course the USA would have been much more aggressive in its attitude towards the Argentine invasion and would have supported United Nations initiatives against the Argentine, which would have put them in difficulty. But in the end, if it had become necessary, say 2 weeks later, when our forces were much more ready and there wasn't much change in the weather in the South Atlantic, I would have deployed the force and sought to crush the Argentines by military means, as indeed our forces did, with obviously dreadful loss of life on our side and much more on the Argentine side, especially with the sinking of the Belgrano. But I would have done much the same thing for the reasons which Michael Foot set out very clearly. We simply could not permit an invasion of a peaceful, the territory of a peaceful state, especially by an Argentine government run by generals, which, as Michael said, had a chest full of medals won in conquest of their own people, because they were brutal dictators.
So I go now. Yeah.
What did you think of the David Frost interview with Margaret Thatcher when he asked her about the Balgona?
Well, he caught her flat because there was a real difficulty with Margaret Thatcher as a quote, quote, war leader. She kept on seeking to interfere, or rather intervene. And this was greatly resented by the chiefs of staff. And since she had no familiarity with the techniques of war or the deployment of forces, she kept on suggesting things to them with the authority of the Prime Minister that they either knew they couldn't undertake or shouldn't undertake because of the risks involved. And now, when the Belgrano which was an old aircraft carrier that the Argentines had bought from the French, was actually steaming away from the Falkland Islands and was outside, just outside the exclusion zone. It wasn't, in terms of the rules of war, a fair target. She insisted upon the attack taking place, as indeed the logbook of the submarine, which was eventually found years later, because it was well hidden, as that demonstrated. So she knew she was in difficulty because at that time, she and a few naval personnel, including the crew of the submarine, knew that the Belgrano was going back towards Argentina and was outside the exclusion zone. So she knew that she was transgressing against the rules of conflict as they were playing at that time. And of course, David Frost, who probably would have got briefing from people inside the Royal Navy, was either sure of that or pretty sure of it, which is why he landed her flat. The person who really caught Margaret Thatcher on the issue, of course, was the woman who telephoned, I think from Gloucester, not a naval expert of any description or connected with the Navy, who simply asked her about the Belgrano on a phone-in during the 1983 election. And Thatcher really fumbled with that very badly.
The 80s was a satirically potent decade with ITV's Spitting Image flying high in the ratings.
Yeah.
What did you make of the accuracy of your puppet, and what effects did the series have on the reputation of the Labour Party?
Well, the main problem at the time was the effect on my kids, who were both in the local comprehensive school. And obviously every Monday morning, they had the usual bullshit from their classmates about you and dad on swimming tonight. So frankly, that's what concerned me most. They were never complaining about it. They never gave the impression of being worried about it. It was years later when I discovered that they'd had actually quite a rough time over it, as you would expect. When it was going out, Steve was 13, 14, 15 years of age. Rachel was 11, 12, 13 years of age. They really developed real resilience, which has stood them in good stead ever since. But that was the main concern for me as an individual. As far as the wider implication was concerned, the only real problem we ever encountered was those opening titles, which showed me on the day I got elected as Labour Party leader, appearing to fall down on Brighton Beach. Actually, I never actually hit the ground and I didn't get wet, but that's a different story. The cameras from a different angle showed that, but of course, that wouldn't have been any fun. So the image of man in a suit falling over on the beach stuck with people when they watched it week after week after week for several years. As far as the puppet was concerned, my kids said that was an improvement on the real thing. And of course, quite a lot of spitting image was very funny. Some of it quite brutal, and generally speaking, much nastier to the Conservatives than it was to us.
Yeah. So just a year into your Labour leadership, Arthur Scargill figureheaded the controversial miners' strike. In recent years, Scargill has spoken openly about your role in the dispute and how he thinks you should have done more. But as a representative of the Labour Party, how important was it to stand up for the working class people who were affected?
Well, I was standing up for the working class people in several ways. First of all, by consistently making the case for coal and making arguments against Thatcher's brutal plans for the closure, the destruction of the whole coal industry. Not simply because of my background as the son of a coal miner and the grandson of coal miners and the nephew of coal miners, and my own constituency, where I had 4,000 people employed in the industry, but also because at that time, when the United Kingdom economy was substantially dependent on coal as a source of energy, 44% dependent, it was crucial that any closure program, and that's bound to exist because it's an extractive industry and no coal mine can last forever or should last forever because of geological conditions and dangers of working. But I also made the case, if you like, the patriotic national case for sustaining a usable coal industry. I also, of course, called for Scargill to have a national ballot of the NUM as required under Article 42 of the NUM Constitution. But he didn't. I'm interested that you would say, Josh, about Scargill figureheading the strike. That's right, because he never actually called it, you see. The strike gathered pace because of a ludicrous error by the National Coal Board in proposing the closure of a pit that wasn't on anybody's closure list and had been registered as a long life pit. And of course, they admitted the mistake afterwards. But by that time, individual pits had come out, whole coal fields had come out. But because there was no national ballot, Nottinghamshire and several individual collieries in Lancashire, Leicestershire, and elsewhere stayed working. And the consequence of that was, of course, a divided labour force because there was no ballot and the virtual absence of sympathetic action, especially by transport workers and power station workers, because there'd been no ballot. And so what Scargill did was to monstrously abuse the solidarity and the loyalty of a marvelous workforce who were desperately fearful of their future and were seeking to take action to change that future, but doing it in a way under Field Marshal Scargill that was guaranteed to be doomed to defeat, as indeed it was. So, I mean, the bloody fool, even, this seems to be a small detail, but it turned into a very big one. He prohibited journalists and photographers and film crews from being behind the miners' lines in any pickets. The result is, of course, that all of the pictures, all of the film that the general public saw was from behind the police lines. And of course, that can give you a pretty distorted picture of what's going on. And the effect on public opinion was catastrophic. So Scargill now hardly ever appears. When he does, it's to try and insult me. It's nothing like the insult and the devastating effect that he inflicted on mining communities throughout the country. I've frequently said that he and Thatcher deserved each other. Nobody else deserved either of them.
Do you think that would have happened at any other time in history?
It could only happen in the Scargill. You see, the rest of the miners' leadership, people like Mick McGathy from Scotland, the president of the Scottish Mine Workers, member of the Communist Party and a great, honest-to-God guy, or Emlyn Williams, the president of the South Wales Miners, who was a close comrade, like McGathy was a close comrade of mine. They never would have led people into that devastating destruction. Either they would have insisted on a ballot before strike action under the terms of the NUM Constitution, or if they'd been overtaken by the spontaneous action taken outside the rules up and down several coalfields, including Scotland and South Wales, then they wouldn't have made the amazing tactical errors that Scargill made. And secondly, when they were able to negotiate, they would have negotiated a different system for examining the well-being and life and remaining life of a coal mine. I know that because in July 1984 and September 1984, together with Stan Orme, my energy spokesman, who was a hugely experienced trade unionist in the engineering industry, we put together proposals for the examination of collieries and technical appraisals, which had to show that life in that coal mine was either limited because of the exhaustion of accessible coal or because of the danger of working there, and therefore the pit could be scheduled for closure. And we used a formulation of words that was accepted by Ian McGregor, the chairman of the National Coal Board, who was a rogue, but with the strong advice and insistence of his fellow directors, all of whom were practical, experienced managers of collieries with a background of decades in the industry. They said to him, these are feasible plans that can ensure the effective management of the coal mining industry, the sustained life for large parts of it, but a formula for closure that we can certainly work with. Both times, in July and September, Scargill rejected those proposals without ever putting them to his own executive council. They never knew that those plans existed. Not even his deputy president, Mick McGarry. I talked to Mick many, many times after the strike was over, and Mick never knew about it, any more than he was ever told about the £1 million in contributions that had come from the Soviet coal miners that eventually found their way in suitcases to the Bank of Ireland. And nobody really knows what happened to quite a lot of that money. So Scargill confined information to a group of 2 or 3 people, which didn't include Peter Heathfield, the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, or Scargill's Deputy President, Mick McGarry, or the rest of the National Executive Committee. So that's the kind of guy we're dealing with. That's the truth of the matter. And of course, it's recorded. There's several decent books written about it. The best book written about it is Marching to the Fault Line. And you can get that from Google, which is a very thorough examination of what happened during the miners' strike. And that demonstrates the truth of everything that I've told you, including the fact that at today's prices, that coal mining strike and the way in which Thatcher fought it with massive police presence, national policing, which is unknown in the United Kingdom, the change of the benefits law for the wives and families of people on strike, the stockpiling of coal. There was 15% more stockpiled coal at power stations, pitheads, and docks in February of 1984 than had ever been in the years since the war. 50% more stockpiled. And, you know, the whole thing was organized very deliberately by Thatcher. The one thing that she'd never anticipated and couldn't believe her good fortune was that the NUM didn't have a national ballot. She would have been fighting a different kind of opposition if they'd had the strength of democracy behind them, but they didn't. So I'm describing to you what happened. It's now a matter of record, which you can check. And throughout the whole thing, Scargill's conduct was scandalous, and his effect and the effect of the combination of him and Thatcher on the mining communities is still being felt all these years later.
So, surviving 2 unsuccessful elections, you remained as Labour leader until 1992, which eventually paved the way for Tony Blair. And
well, I lost once in 87 and then again in 92. So I didn't survive 2 defeats. I was defeated twice.
Okay. And then it was coined as New Labour. At what point were you aware that times were changing?
Well, constantly. I've been aware of that since I was about 14. As Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and the rest of them have repeatedly said when they assumed the leadership and then gloriously won the 97 election, I use their words, that Kinnock made it possible, because what they inherited was a serious, well-organized Labour Party with credible policies that they had 5 more years to develop. And they were also up against a totally discredited Conservative government, where the novelty of John Major in 1992 had worn off completely in shreds, even though he's quite a decent man, by 1997. So the fact that they didn't have to really spend more than minutes on Labour Party affairs and could concentrate entirely on developing policy and putting their message across was a boon to them. And they've been kind enough, comradely enough to acknowledge that. And I mean, I'll give you an instance of quite a substantial change that they brought about. Most of the press in Britain, as you will well know, is very biased in the direction of the Conservative Party, sometimes to slavish levels, absurd levels indeed, levels that offends their own journalists sometimes. And of course, they hit me with just about everything they had, not just at election time, but throughout every single year. Okay, I don't whinge about that. That goes with the territory. You expect that if you're the leader of the Labour Party. And the Labour Party expects it. Conscious of the effect that that had had, Tony and particularly his press spokesman, my very, very close and dear friend, Alistair Campbell, thought they tried to neutralize that as much as they could. So they undertook a charm offensive, even with the most biased and dogmatic newspaper editors and proprietors. Now, in one sense, as they acknowledge, they had an easier task because even those newspapers had become alienated from the Conservative Party by 1997. And so they were aiming at a more open goal than had been the case for the previous 50 years. And they exploited it, believing, as I say, that they could at least neutralize or soften the attacks. What actually happened, especially so far as the Murdoch newspapers are concerned, was it went further. And by 1997, 3 years after Tony became leader of the party, the Murdoch group had swung in behind the Labour Party. Now, I warned Tony and Alistair and everybody else about that. I said, you take whatever advantage you can, that's okay, but do not defer to them because they will betray you. And of course, in the end, they did betray them. But I can understand why they were doing it, even though initially I confessed my outrage to them because the Murdoch newspapers were so vicious and so anti-Labour, not anti-Kinnock, as I say, that's par for the course, but so viciously anti-Labour, misrepresenting, exaggerating, distorting all the time. And obviously, I regarded them to be the enemy, and I didn't want my comrades to be supping with the enemy. But in the end, it worked, and I understood why they were doing it. So that's one change that took place that initially angered me, but then I could see the tactical sense of it, went along with it. And for a period, it worked. But it was never going to work all the time. And I knew that. And I guess they did too. In terms of policy, they didn't change much, actually. They fought the 97 election pretty much on the same policies that we'd established by 1992. The problem for us in 92 was that because we changed the policies so much, especially on unilateral nuclear disarmament, attitude towards the European community, nationalization, trade union legislation, we changed the policies terrifically and very productively. But of course, it meant that we didn't have a hell of a lot of time to signify that these were deep-rooted, permanent changes in policy. So when the Conservatives retaliated by saying that our changes were superficial and opportunistic, for a lot of people who don't take politics too strenuously and are not anoraks, that had a certain appeal. By the time Tony came along a couple of years later, after the catastrophe of Black Wednesday and the collapse of Tory economic credibility, and was able to attack the Tories relentlessly and not have to worry about managing the party too much, much had changed. And I rejoiced in that, of course, as I was ecstatic about the victory in '97. But, you know, they were the first people to acknowledge, and they've done so repeatedly, that their job in policy terms and in terms of the self-discipline of the Labour Party, their job was somewhat easier because of what we'd done in the previous years.
How much power did Rupert Murdoch have at that time?
Not as much as he thought he had. I mean, after the '92 election, the front page of the Sun said it was the Sun that won it. And they were basing that claim on the words of Lord McAlpine, the former treasurer of the Conservative Party, who 2 days after the election said the heroes of this campaign were the editors of the tabloids. They won the election against Kinnock. I didn't make that claim. That was McAlpine. On that basis, the Murdoch papers claimed that they'd won the election. And they'd certainly contributed to it, because the reality is this, and it's still pretty much the reality, even though newspapers have declined in their significance and in their circulation. There's about, according to every analysis ever undertaken in the United Kingdom, it's slightly different in other countries, other democracies with a free press, but in the United Kingdom, something between 4 and 6% of the electorate do take seriously what their newspapers tell them. And their judgment politically is significantly affected by the newspapers. So it's not 100% of people, it's not 100% of Conservatives or 100% of Labour or 100% of the electorate. But of course, in a first-past-the-post system, you only need to influence about 4 to 6%, because in a two-party or 2.5-party first-past-the-post system, that's the equivalent of 8 to 10 to 12% of the electorate in terms of the way in which they're influenced. And of course, the newspaper owners and editors know that. I'll give you a little bit of proof of that, but there are many instances. On the Thursday before the 1992 election, the editors of the allegedly competing tabloids got together, the Express, the Sun, the Mail, the Star. They got together and they decided, not the Mirror, they decided that they would have a focused and concentrated campaign of attack on us. The subject they chose was immigration policy, which had no huge significance in the election up until then. I mean, it was an issue, but not anything, not in the top 10 or top 15 issues. But they decided that they were going to accuse us of having an open door immigration policy. Now, this obviously implied the Commonwealth, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, and they were going to allege that we had an open door policy. In order to have a hook to hang it on, they got Kenneth Baker, the Home Secretary, to make a speech making this allegation. And on the Saturday before the election, all of them carried on their front page the allegation about Labour's quote, quote, open door immigration policy. They used different words, but that was the substance of their headlines. And to support that, two of the newspapers, the Express and the Mail, undertook a promotion campaign to try and increase their readership. And it just so happened that the promotion campaigns took place in Tory marginal seats, especially in Essex and Kent and outer London. So they distributed about 40,000 newspapers free through the letterboxes of 40,000 houses, let's say 80,000 voters in crucial seats, all carrying the message on the front page that we had an open door immigration policy, which of course we didn't. We've always been in support of managed immigration. And nobody's ever had an open door policy. Maybe Corbyn did at one stage, but nobody took any notice of him in any case. And this was the degree of coordination they were prepared to engage in. And of course, when we had an election result in which, as Robert Worcester, the guy who founded and ran Maury polling, told me, the total of the bottom 11 majorities of Conservative winners in the 92 election was 1,240 votes. So that's how newspapers can, if they set their minds to it, influence a relatively small number of votes in the right seats, because the Tories ended up with a majority of 21 seats. And as Bob Worcester told me, 11 of those majorities added up to less than 1,300 votes. For the 21 lowest majorities, it came to less than 5,000 votes in an election which 27 million people voted. So that's how close you can come.
So we fast forward to 2005. You were made a life peer and earned your title as Lord Kinnock. How do you view your responsibility as a life peer?
Well, it's a bit difficult at the moment because my wife has got Alzheimer's. Obviously, I've got caring duties, and caring for my beloved wife and the hours of the House of Lords don't really match. So my colleagues in the Lords, on the Labour benches, but also amongst those who are not on the Labour benches, are very understanding at my effectively prolonged absence. So I haven't been able to be active for quite a long time because I've got to give absolute priority to my wife. As far as being in the Lords are concerned, I never took to it enthusiastically because I believe, as I've long believed, that the unelected House of Lords should not be a legislature in a democracy. And there are several ways of changing that. The most practical plan that anybody's come up with was the reform of the House of Lords proposals put together by my lamented dear friend Robin Cook, who sadly died. And Robin proposed that we had a House of Lords that was 75% elected from the regions of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and 25% appointed for a limited term on the grounds of their distinction in various professional fields, the law, science, the arts, academia, wherever, so that the House of Lords always had that body of expert knowledge, 25% of it with a maximum term of 10 years, and the rest of the Lords was proportionately representative of every region in the United Kingdom. I think that would be a sensible change. I think that the various abuses of our unwritten constitution in recent years, particularly by the Boris Johnson government, justify very radical constitutional reform in the United Kingdom. And I think that that democratization of the House of Lords, while retaining necessary expertise in various vital fields, would be one of the constitutional changes we should make. I hope to live to see it, but I'm 80 now, and the prospect is fading. The problem is only a Labour government would do it with the support and assistance of the Liberals and the Greens and so on. And there might be, by the time it comes about, a few Conservatives who are willing to undertake this necessary renovation, this necessary modernization and democratization of the way in which we are ruled in the United Kingdom. So that's what I hope will take place. Otherwise, if we try to carry on as we are, our whole concept of democracy and direct representation in the United Kingdom will become even more shriveled, and people will lose trust and confidence, which of course is a source of terrible harm for democracy, for real freedom of expression and representation.
Why do you think it's so important for governments to invest in future generations?
Oh, it's vital. And very basic and simply, because they are the future. Apart from that practical reality, that if you really do love the country and respect the world, you will look after the young generations. That's just a matter of straightforward requirement, duty. It's done even by undemocratic governments, the Chinese and God knows who else. Always, of course, on the basis of dreadful political bigotry, but even they look after their kids. But in addition to that practical requirement, there's a fundamental moral requirement. One of the ways of judging the worth of a government, the worth of a country, is how it deals with its young and vulnerable. And if the young are neglected, or the vulnerable are neglected, or even abused, that's an appalling country to live in. And you multiply it by the number of countries, and it becomes a fragile and very endangered world. So looking after the kids is item number one. It's simple as that.
So looking back at your career, what's your proudest achievement?
In broad terms, I guess working and planning and plotting and campaigning and arm twisting the Labour Party into being credible and electable. I'm quite proud of that, even though I didn't pull it off in the end myself. And there are the other things that I'm quite satisfied with, are changes that I managed to bring about in the European Commission in terms, for instance, of Maritime Safety Law. There have been no major incidents in European waters involving shipping collisions or foundering on the rocks or loss of life in this century. Right at the beginning of the century, one or two really grievous environmental disasters, but for the last 20 years, really, nothing of significance. And that's because of the changes in law and practice that we made in cooperation with the most responsible ship owners and shipbuilders. And the crews and the officers and the way in which they've worked to implement the highest standards in the world. So I'm quite proud of that. I'm quite proud of the changes that we completed in civil aviation that enables people to fly more freely and for aircraft to be safer and better regulated. And the fact that crash helmets are compulsory in all the countries of the European Union for motorbike riders, the fact that we've got compulsory seatbelts in the back of cars as well as the front. There are a few other changes that I'm quite happy about.
So are those sort of things how you would like your leadership to be remembered?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, and maybe they'll obscure me falling down on the beach in Brighton.